Tom Murray, welcome back to Shrink Wrap Radio.
So glad to be here, Dr. Dave. Thank you.
Well, it's good to have you back. And I say welcome back because I interviewed you back in 2008 when you were working at a college counseling center.
That's right. That's right. I remember that fondly.
And by the way, congratulations on your new book, Making Nice with Naughty, an intimacy guide for the rule-following, organized, perfectionist, practical. I got something wrong here in my typing. Rules, well, maybe not. Making Nice with Naughty, an intimacy guide for the rule-following, organized, perfectionist, practical, and color within the line types. So it's a
That's right.
practical type. Okay. So, as I mentioned before, you were working in a when we spoke way back in 2008, you were working in a college counseling center. What happened in your life to create this shift to becoming to focus on sexuality?
That's a great question. Actually, that was the original plan. When I went to the University of Florida, pursued graduate degrees in couple and family therapy, and sex therapy is a natural extension of that work. While I was at the University of Florida, I was also a hall director, and prior to that, in undergrad, I was a resident advisor,
Okay.
and so I had substantial student affairs experience after all that time. And when I when we started a family, it just made more, I guess, I was being responsible, maybe a bit over controlled, as we'll get to talk about later, and wanting a job that gave me a consistent paycheck. And so having that student affairs experience, I moved in that direction. But the itch to become a sex therapist remained. And then when the timing was right in 2014, I began to pursue that credential. And then when I left the university in 2017, that allowed me to start that niche specifically in couples and sex therapy.
You mentioned being a dorm advisor, a resident advisor,
Right.
working with students, and it flashed me back to when I was an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania. I got into some trouble and had to have the
Dr. Dave.
oh yeah. And so to get out of the persuade the police that my friend and I were in fact university students, call our RA. And fortunately the RA was in. I mean, he had no idea what we were up to, but oh yeah, they're good students. They're students here at the university. So let's hear it for RAs.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think about that time in my life. I reflect on it often, and it was just so enriching to be a resident advisor, and the community that was built, the friendships that were forged. In fact, a friend of mine who was a fellow RA, we were just texting earlier today. So this is, over 20 years ago, and
Wow.
we're maintain that relationship.
Oh, that's great. That says something about you too, and your own emphasis on connection and maintaining relationship. And I have to ask you because you said it was something about you following the rules or something. Are you in fact an intimate? Are you a rule following, organized, perfectionist, practical, and color within the line type of person?
That in many ways, yes, but also that can be just my own convictions around um, uh, political things. For example, I can, if I feel like something violates a social justice norm, then I might shout a little louder to to make a point
Yeah.
where some over controlled people, and we can talk about this later, there are two subtypes of over-controlled people. There's the overly agreeable and then the overly disagreeable, which I didn't really explore in the book. But the overly agreeables are more interested in being liked, and the overly disagreeables are the ones more interested in being right.
I think
And
I'm number
so,
one. I'm the first type. Um, so what can you tell us about your work these days? Um, yeah, what are you doing?
well, now I own a group practice in North Carolina. I have a social worker and a counselor, and the program primarily provides sex and couples therapy, although we do individual therapy. And up until just about a month ago, I also had psychiatry as a service, but we decided to leave that away for practical reasons. Uh, and in addition, my practice also includes an element of forensic sexology, which I know that you kind of dabbed your into that area relative to serial killers. But the forensic sexology, doing mental health evaluations and psychosexual evaluations for people who've gotten involved in the legal system. In addition, I'm also licensed in Oregon, Pennsylvania, and Florida, and so I have a few clients from those states as well.
Did you get licensed in those other states just so that you'd be able to serve those clients, or are they places where you have vacation homes or something?
I wish. I wish. I have very good friends in Oregon who own a group practice called New Start Psychiatry in Oregon, and I did some collaboration with them, and it made sense to get licensed in Oregon. And then in Pennsylvania, that's where I was born and raised. And then Florida, of course, is where I went to graduate school. So, you kind of pick them up along the way and try to make the use out of them. And of course, with the pandemic, has really just altered the landscape for a lot of mental health professionals to begin providing services via telehealth in a way that really just didn't exist on that scale prior to the pandemic.
And so how was that for you? Did that fit your work well, or did you find you had difficult adjustments to make to begin doing it in a telehealth way?
I much prefer, specifically when it comes to doing couples work, I much prefer seeing them in person. My style of doing couples therapy, I think, lends better to in person. That being said, I recognize that for a lot of people, that having that option, the telehealth option, just makes it more practical for them, and therefore, I
Yeah.
think it incentivizes them perhaps more to access services using telehealth.
Uh-huh. Well, what led you to your writing your book, making nice with naughty?
Yeah. So I think there's a population of people who have grown up essentially being told naughty is a bad word. Don't be naughty, be nice, be good, follow the rules, and uh, uh, and so they were really domesticated into seeing naughtiness as really something bad. And what I discovered when working with individuals and couples around sex and sexuality, it's that rule orientation that interfered with their ability to find meaningful meaning and fulfillment in their sex lives. And so one day, in fact, this was in September of 2020, working with a couple, and it dawned on me that I bet I could predict whether the nature of this couple's sex life by just asking one question: Are you a be careful parent, or are you a have fun parent? In other words, if your child is on the playground and they're wanting to jump off of something really high, is your impulse to say be careful, or is your impulse to be like, oh, have fun? Right? And what I found is that the be careful parents tended to have more problems in the bedroom or within their intimate relationship.
What a cleverly indirect question. This is like the detective in a mystery novel who asked this perfect question.
Yeah, yeah, and uh, kind of concurrently, I began to learn about this emerging psychotherapy called radically open dialectical behavior therapy, RODBT, which Dr. Thomas Lynch, developed in almost in response to traditional DBT that, as you know, Marsha Linehan developed. And that RODBT is specifically for people who lean over controlled or who have too much self control. And that was the correlation that I noticed, is that too much self control was a significant factor in low sexual desire, as well as a sense of distance interpersonally with their partner, a low social connection with their partner, as well as sexual problems such as ejaculatory control problems, delayed ejaculation, for example, or vaginismus, dyspareunia. There's all various sexual problems that seem to be highly correlated with people who lean in that direction of too much self-control, which is, the culture out there really values self-control and put sees it as virtues: planning, organized, high degree of responsibility, those things. And in many ways, those are our strengths. But I find that if they're going to be a problem, if that temperament is going to be a problem, it's going to be a problem in people's sex life and intimate relationships.
Now, I would have thought that that characterization might apply more to an older group. Are you talking of what age group are you talking about mostly, or is it not segregated by age at all?
Definitely not segregated by age. In fact, if you think again, like temperaments are neither good or bad. Introversion, extroversion are two of the most common temperaments, and those temperaments are also on a continuum. And so one can be mildly extroverted or greatly extroverted. In a similar way, over-controlled temperament, and I'll speak primarily about that. Uh, at the extreme ends of it, you have disorders such as autism, anorexia, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, paranoid personality disorder. So at the very far end, you have those types of conditions. And as you know, they can impact people across the lifespan.
Yeah, one of the things I like about your book is that you go to great lengths to reassure people that if they have this personality style, to not label it as good or bad, or not label themselves as good or bad.
That's right. That's right. In part, because I'm over controlled,
Okay.
and so as by the way, most therapists, or just maybe not the most, but a disproportionate number of therapists lean over controlled. People who go to graduate school in general tend to lean over controlled.
Yeah.
So there's again a lot of these qualities that we think that we associate with being over controlled make us very successful in our lives. So it was really important for me, both as a author and as a clinician, to avoid the tendency to pathologize um, this phenomenon simply because there are areas of distress associated with it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I'd like to back away from your book a bit and to get your observations about more generally about what's going on in our culture and in the world around sexuality. So What's your impression of the state of sex these days?
Oh, that is what a big question.
I know it's a big question. I'm assuming that given your specialty that you probably subscribe to some journals and so on, where they give you statistics and they talk about cultural trends, et cetera.
Well, right now, of course, um, there's this huge confusion, I think, within the United States, in particular, around gender expression and gender identity,
Yeah.
and some people struggling with uh, choices around pronouns, and what people prefer to how people prefer to be addressed. So we have, that element, which is, we hear of states such as Florida and Texas forbidding access to transgender health care, particularly for minors. So we see a lot of these hot topics that are developing. Of course, uh, the pro choice, pro life is an important part of sexuality that disproportionately impacts one sex over another. And then we have this these cultural assumptions around porn addiction. That's a hot topic among sexual health professionals, in part because ASEC, the American Association for Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, which is through which I have my certification, being the premier organization for certifying sexual health professionals. We have a we have found very little empirical support for the use of the phrase sex addiction, but it's widely popular, and instead we prefer to call it out of control sexual behavior rather than an addiction. So, for
Uh-huh.
example, David Lee, a psychologist who's written a lot in this area, I believe he's the one that said if someone washes their hands 100 times a day, we wouldn't call that a hand washing addiction. Or if someone watches 6 hours of football on a Sunday, we wouldn't call that addiction. But for some reason, if we add porn to it, we immediately associate it with an addiction.
Interesting. That was one of the things I wanted to ask you about was porn. So so in that organization and in your own practice, you're not regarding porn as addictive.
That's right.
And so what stance do you take towards it?
Well, typically, what we find is that if there's a problematic relationship with porn, there are other um, elements that seem to be associated with it. So, for example, uh, religiosity is highly correlated with developing a problematic relationship with porn. So, the more religious someone is, the more likely there's going to be an ego dystonic relationship with their porn use. Um, uh, uh, or that there may be already prior to the development of the problematic porn use, a unsatisfactory relationship with their primary partner, where perhaps a period of time has gone by where it may have been a sexless relationship, and the
Yeah.
person uses pornography in order to address some of their own sexual needs. I find that the those who are assigning the label of sex addiction or porn addiction primarily comes from partners, not from mental health professionals. So if you're on the receiving end, feeling like your partner is putting too much emphasis on sex, it's a knee-jerk reaction then to assume that the person must have a sex addiction. Now, that isn't to say, of course, that there are some people who legitimately have an out of control relationship with porn, where it does interfere with perhaps pursuing relationships that are in a healthy way, or it interferes with their ability to maintain employment, etc. Those instances certainly do exist, but for the most part, the vast majority, I would, in my assessment, who've been given that label, there are other contexts that better explain the behavior than simply calling it an addiction.
Yeah. I'm aware that tomorrow is the midterm elections. People are going to be voting if they haven't already voted by mail proxy. Um, and you said something about politics, and it's so we're living in a situation where politics cross-cuts sexuality and has impacts and implications, right, for sexuality, for one's own conception of their sexuality, as well as their sexual transactions with other people.
Yeah,
That's that's kind of interesting, right? I don't.
yeah,
It's a new
it is kind of
perspective.
it's that's right. It is somewhat surprising that uh, what used to be regarded as something sacred to the bedroom has become really part of the national conversation. We used to say, well, whatever occurs in the bedroom, that's that person's business, and we've taken that from the bedroom and placed upon it evaluations that we then associate with the individual.
And plus, we put it on video. Some of us put it on video, and others of us watch the video, and then that shapes um, that can shape the partner's expectations
Right.
and concerns, their own self-doubts. Well, geez, I watched these people on pornography, and they're doing all kinds of stuff and they're loving it, so maybe I should be doing that too.
And that maybe my partner should want to be doing that as well.
Yeah.
And then they realize, and that's in it. That porn literacy is also an area of advocacy for sexual health professionals. Uh, we want people to understand that porn is entertainment. It is not education. And so, to give an example, um, we uh, the if one understands more about how films are produced, then it takes some of the glitter off of the experience.
Yeah, it's easy to forget
One of
that there are a whole bunch of other people in the room, people with
Yes,
cameras,
yes,
microphones, etc.
and they're taking breaks. They're taking these are they have to follow the employment. Most of these films are made in California, and so they have to follow a lot of the employment laws that are still in place. Uh, um, a little known uh, uh, fact about me is that I'm an external consultant for a major adult toy distributor, which also um, distributes a significant number of pornography. And my job for this company is that I evaluate the porn to ensure that it doesn't violate community standards. So, in fact, I did that over this past weekend, and my job is to critique it to ensure that consent is clear, that it doesn't engage in any activity that would be attractive to the particularly perverse. And so there are companies that are really intentional about the kind of pornography that they're distributing to ensure that it does keep with community standards.
Well, that is a surprising thing to learn about you. and some people would probably think, "Wow, that's a dream job," but I wouldn't think so. You talked about porn as entertainment, and my own experiences with porn is really boring stuff. You have to watch very much of it. It's
Well,
very
that
repetitive. There's only so much that's going to happen.
well, that's absolutely right. And for me, I'm watching for what's wrong with it,
Yeah,
not for what's exciting about it.
yeah.
That's quite the difference for me. I remember telling my dad how much I got paid to be this consultant, and it didn't matter that I had a PhD and a business. It was at that point he said, "Son, you have finally arrived."
In other words, he thought it sounded like a good gig.
It sounded like a good gig, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting gig. What
Which
about
is,
yeah.
if I may, when I hear people say they might say about their spouse, that they watch too much porn. In my mind, I'm thinking, I don't think so, because they knew how much porn I watch for a living. Uh,
Uh,
or how would they feel if their partner uh, were paid uh, handsomely to watch the porn? Would that make much of a
yeah.
difference? Now, that being said, people have moral reasons to not watch porn or want to be with someone who watches porn, and that's totally acceptable. So, I think people can choose for themselves to what degree, if any, pornography is going to have in their lives. But what we do know is that couples who watch porn together tend to report a higher level of sexual and relationship satisfaction.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Um, what has been the impact of COVID on sexual behavior, sexuality, sexual activity?
It depends on the group that you're, the demographic. So, we have polyamory. Polyamory, ethical non-monogamy. These are other aspects of culture that I think are increasingly um, uh, a part of social discourse. And so, as you can imagine, COVID really put the kibosh on swinging or you know people pursuing non-monogamous sexual relationships, uh, and
Yeah,
then during COVID, you may have heard about monkeypox
yeah,
and its prevalence among men who have sex with other men. Um, you know, all of these things had certainly had implications. Now, immediately when COVID began, a lot of people uh, were incentivized to move in together who may not have lived together because they had to socially isolate, and so you may have seen an uptick in people using that time to explore each other's bodies and um, themselves. Uh, but as time went on and people were only spending time with each other, well, that level of closeness uh, minimizes a lot of what we find to be erotic, such as mystery and spontaneity. And so that negatively impacted couples' sexual relationships.
wow. So many dimensions to this. Um, what's the state of people getting together these days? I spoke to one of my TAs back when I was still teaching, and and somehow to- the topic of dating came up. Maybe I asked him, are you dating much? And he told me that, um, well, we don't date, we hook up. And so he described he would go to a party, and if there was some sexual excitement with some woman there, they would hook up, and without necessarily any expectations of that was going to lead to going steady or to getting married or engaged or anything like that. So I don't know if that was a very rare thing or if that's kind of a very common thing for young people these days.
Yeah, I think it's what we're finding is that there's greater acceptance in certain circles for people to enjoy um, sexual encounters with others, which may or may not include penetration. It may just simply be manual stimulation, kissing, oral sex. So there's a variety of ways in which consenting adults can enjoy each other's bodies without this expectation of a commitment. So, when we were children, we would go to a playground, and if there were other children at the playground, we would play with those other children, and we would depart the playground without an expectation that they will be our playmates for life, right? And so I think that the parallel can be made for a lot of people that they see sex as adult play that they get to enjoy with other people, uh, and that and within sex therapy community, we have a saying: "Don't yuck someone else's yum." And so, I don't cast dispersions on other people's choices as long as that it's consensual. If both parties are agreeing to the terms, then it's totally acceptable, from my opinion. Um, although there are others who hold, for whatever reason, uh, different expectations for themselves than others sexually, and that can be acceptable too.
It seems to me that pandemics, uh, maybe a lot of the sexual morality of the past that came down to us were in some part the result of pandemics where sexual intimacy would, lead to deaths. And the fact that the boundaries between nations, cultures, etc., with modern travel and so on, uh, these pandemics are. I'm not sure. I think we're still in one, and I'm not sure that this is going to be the end. And so I'm thinking that there may be a re-embracing of older moralities driven by the necessity of the desire to stay alive.
Certainly, I think that that's true if one's choices easily impact one's community, right? So, with such as airborne contagions, for example. But it's relatively recent within the scope of human history that we understood the nature of germs and viruses, and so most of the sexual morality that we come to know, such as around virginity, was really about viewing women as property, and so if you had a daughter, for example, that you could confirm was a virgin, then her value to another family was significantly higher. And so there's a lot of economics that was involved in
Mm.
legislating sexuality. Um, that being said, the over controlled people, um, tend to have a high degree of moral superiority. And so, if you recall, particularly from the 90s, there was the purity movement of the 90s, where churches, in particular, had programs to have teenagers, but primarily the girls within the congregations, to commit to remaining celibate and free of impure thoughts. Uh, and so, if you're already an over-controlled person biotemperamentally, and then you grow up in a community that really privileges those moral stances, then when you do say "I do," and you're supposed to just the flip of a switch, be enjoying sex, it can create a lot of problems for that person in that relationship to transition into a phase of life where sex is to be enjoyable and fun, if you've been told your whole life that it's a source of danger.
Yeah, yeah. You remind me, I came up partly in a fundamentalist Christian environment. And so I remember in my initial sexual encounters, the struggle of the female partners with, I felt less of that constraint for myself.
Mm.
uh, something I attribute it to is something about maleness and the culture of maleness, at least at the time that I came up. Um, so my own initial experience, my initial orgasm experience with a young woman, with a girlfriend, was feeling like I had found God.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Oh, this this is what it's about. And if God's down on this, well, something's going to have to change here. That really
Yeah,
was a parting place, one of the parting places for me with traditional religion.
I think again, with traditional religion, there's has been for centuries, it would seem, just this double message, that the implications of sex for boys and men, uh, very different than the implications for
Right.
girls and women.
Yeah.
And I think we would give lip service to um, uh, the abstinence relative to boys and men, but the social consequence for boys and men to have sex prior to marriage was much less than the social consequences for girls and women to have sex prior to marriage.
Well, in fact, it might enhance your standing,
That's right.
as a young man, to be sexually active and, in a lot of situations in public high schools and so on. uh, I imagine that's still a standard of what happens between males.
It very much is. And if you're already over controlled, the social message is that males should know everything there is to know about sex right out of the gate.
Yeah,
And as a consequence, there's that message. And yet, the sex education that we get in this country is so paltry that they don't understand there are going to be times when they want an erection and they're not going to get one. And so the expectation is that you should have an erection every time you want one, when that just isn't the case. And that when they don't quite understand that being a normal, a natural phenomenon, and then they have the experience, then they're going to be anticipating problems in the future, and that spike of adrenaline about am I going to be able to get an erection interferes with their ability to get an erection. And
yeah.
so it turns into this pattern. And then, depending on the nature of the over controlled person, they might start avoiding sex or intimate situations with their partner because they're afraid they're not going to get an erection, and then that produces a relationship distance, and which fuels its own set of problems. And so you can see just how, as a systems trained therapist, you can see how all of these various elements impact sexual expression.
Well, it's certainly, speaking of systems orientation, I mean, we're definitely talking about wheels within wheels within wheels. Is terribly complex. That
That it is, and when it comes to male sexuality, I think for too long have we've implied that it isn't, that it's very simple, and that only female sexuality is complex. And now we're appreciating that sexuality is complex for people across the board.
yeah, yeah. I'm thinking back to the times, the days of Wilhelm Reich and other early psychoanalysts, and there was this uh, uh, movement towards sexual hygiene, which basically meant sex education, because presumably there wasn't a lot of people were ignorant about the mechanics and all the ins and outs, so to speak. and but today we're flooded with sexual information, right? In all sorts of media. When I was a kid and I heard them, and I, in some ways, came up in a sheltered environment because of that religious thing, and or somebody talk about a rubber, and a rubber, what's a rubber? And today, probably kids from very, very early on all know about what a rubber is, right? And and yet our sexual difficulties haven't gone away.
They have not. They have not. And one may kind of have a general uh, sense. Teenager may have a general sense what a condom is, but that doesn't mean they know how to use them. I have two teenage boys, and my oldest had his first girlfriend last year, and I said, "Well, you know what that means? Condom demonstration." And so at the dinner table, I had condoms and I had phalluses, and both he and my younger son, I used that as an opportunity to demonstrate how to use
Uh-huh.
condoms, but in a very low stress, it's just a matter of fact. This is how
Yeah.
we used it, um, and what the evidence suggests is that when the younger you are and the more thorough your sex education is during childhood and adolescence, the longer you delay your first sexual episode. So by treating sex as just this normal, natural part of life with quality education, people we find that people tend to delay sex, but we're in a culture of abstinence where we think that the best way to handle this is not talking about it,
Yeah.
and then we wonder why in so many communities there are uh, teenage pregnancy uh, existing. Although it certainly has gotten better since I think the 80s, but it's still in those communities that feel abstinence is the only way. There isn't any evidence that sexual health outcomes are better.
Yeah, we come back to the political divide, political cultural divide that exists today in our culture, and and maybe even in other countries, even though their history is a little different than ours. I think a lot
Mm.
of these dynamics are similar. And so there's real resistance to sex education in schools.
Yeah.
And
And well, there's this cultural anti-science in general.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I didn't mean to get us off into such a burdensome area. What's your advice to our listeners and our viewers about healthy sexual expression? What would you want them to take away from our conversation here?
Well, the ultimate takeaway is that within that people get to decide what is their own sexual style, and then they get to negotiate that with their partner, who also gets to decide their own sexual style. That it isn't society's uh, 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 right to define for you what is erotic, for example. That people decide that for themselves, and that those who have problems relative to sexual expression and intimacy with their partner, the basis of my book is to um, is really to speak to those people who seem so rule oriented, who have this strong belief about how the world should be, must be, and has to be. Um, that that rule following orientation, there's a whole uh, world of opportunity to enjoy sex, and for a lot of people, um, uh, their sex life is again a very significant source of meaning. Um, you know, it's so sad when I hear some of my patients talk about the sexual side effects of medication, which we didn't talk about much, or I didn't talk about much in the book. But they go to their prescriber, and the prescriber somewhat poo-poos it without acknowledging that when you're on medication and your desire is tanked or you have difficulty orgasming, how impactful that is emotionally and psychologically and interpersonally. That it deserves its attention. Where people are like, well, the depression is more important than whether you're able to orgasm. Uh, when I would argue that it's precisely someone's ability to have some fun in this context in the bedroom that may be helpful in managing the depression.
Uh-huh. Interesting. So who should buy your book and why?
Anyone who is rule following, organized, perfectionist, practical, and color within the line type, who recognize for themselves that there's something missing relevant relative to their sex life, or they wonder, why does my partner and I have so much distance between us? Um, uh, you know, the over-controlled temperament, a perfect example of an over-controlled person, or the prototypical example, it's someone who goes behind their partner to rearrange the dishwasher because it wasn't done right.
Yeah.
And if you can imagine what that must feel like to your partner, to feel like they're never ever quite measuring up to their other partner standards, how that
Yeah.
might impact sexual receptivity, for example. Um, so the book is really meant for the general audience of people who have come to recognize that their quality of too much self control, though a virtue in many areas of their life, has created these impediments within their sexual and intimate relationship. And I go through a number of strategies informed by radically open dialectical behavior, um, uh, um, acceptance and commitment therapy, and uh, uh, darn, I just totally REBT. Uh, what is it? Uh, do you know who I'm talking about, Dr. Dave?
Unfortunately, I don't. But
Totally.
what you're going through right now happens to me regularly.
Yeah, rational emotive behavior therapy. That's what
Oh,
it was.
okay.
Albert Ellis,
Albert Ellis, of course.
rational emotive behavior therapy. And so there's these well-established uh, therapeutic approaches that help the reader examine their own mind chatter and to lean into anxiety, knowing that whatever that is their growth edge, and in that process they are able to develop the level of intimacy that they both want and fear at the same time.
Okay, those are very good reasons to buy your book. And Dr. Tom Murray, I want to thank you for being my guest again on Shrink Rap Radio.